Hello everyone and welcome to our second video on Unity game development. In today's lecture, we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to focus mainly on the scene view. We're going to talk about how we can start adding things to our scene, and we're going to talk about what game objects are and how we organize game objects in our hierarchy view. So the big thing to remember about the scene view is that the scene view holds all of the objects in our game. The scene view is basically a visual representation of what the contents of our game will be. And by default, we start with a camera over here, and we start with a lamp over here. So to understand the scene view, we have to understand a couple of things. The first, which should be relatively familiar to those of you that have had 3D art and animation, are the three axes in the scene view. So when we're dealing with three-dimensional space, or 3D space, we know that we can't just have the X and Y axes, because X and Y represent only two-dimensional space, a traditional Cartesian or coordinate plane. We are dealing with 3 dimensions, and the third dimension is our Z dimension. I talked about this in the last video, but it's going to become very important today as we break down the coordinate system a little bit more, that we understand these 3 axes. And each object is going to have their own relative axes, and then we have global axes, which we'll talk about in a minute. So when we talk about scene view, I'm going to pop up my notes here. There's a couple of things to know about scene view. The first one is an easy way to check out what's going on in our scene. We have something called fly-through mode. Fly-through mode is really handy because if I'm in my scene and I hold right-click, I can look around, but I also can use W, S, A, and D. Those of you that have played first-person games will be familiar with this control scheme. I can use those to move around my scene, and it makes working with my scene a lot easier. I can also use Q to go down and E to go up. So in this view, we use WSAD to move. Oop, if I could type. To move. Q to go down. And E to go up. That's fly-through mode. The other thing that I want to show you, if we want to see a particular perspective, or if we want to focus only on maybe a top-down view or a straight-on view, I can select any of these axes in my scene view gizmo. That's what we call this thing, is the scene view gizmo. We can select any of the axes to orient ourselves in that direction. So if I want to look top-down, I can press Y, and now I'm looking from the Y perspective. And I can see how everything is laid out in terms of Z and X. This is a really great way to organize my elements in a horizontal fashion. So this would allow me, for example, to move the camera around without actually changing its Y value, because I'm moving it in Y perspective. I'm not changing the Y value. Similarly, I can look on Z, and I can look on my X plane. I'm going to let go of that camera for now. Okay, so we've looked at fly-through mode, we've looked at the scene view gizmo, so let's talk about actually adding things to our scene. Everything in our scene view is broken down into a game object. A game object is any object in our scene. This includes cameras. Cameras are game objects. Lamps are game objects, or lights. As well as all the actual components that we're going to build our scene with. So a character might be a game object, a car might be a game object, a weapon or a treasure that you pick up. Any of that stuff would be considered a game object. Game objects have 2 components. Game objects are made of what's called any object in our scene. It's made up of what is called a transform and a container. The transform is used to represent the visual location of an object. If I select my camera, notice over here that I have a transform tab. And this transform tab tells me everything that I need to know about the location, rotation, and scale of my camera. And if I want to, I can move this camera rather than dragging it up and down or left and right or whatever. I can move the camera by setting specific values. So if I want my camera to be at the scene's origin, I could say 0, 0, 0, and that's going to put the camera at the origin of my scene. Similarly, I can rotate and scale the camera based on whatever values I put in here. So transform just has to do with the position of the object. And this transform element or transform option exists for every game object in the Unity editor. Every game object has the same transform settings. Containers vary based on the type of game object we have. So if we look over here on the right, my container consists of some camera options because I'm dealing with a camera. If I select a lamp, the lamp has different container options. My container is a light container because I'm dealing with light instead of a camera. So transform always stays the same in terms of position, rotation, and scale, but my objects change their inspector options based on what type of component I have or what the container is. So let's actually add some interesting things to our scene. If my camera is looking in this direction, I'm going to go ahead and place an object in this scene. So I'm going to go to component, or sorry, game object up here, and I'm going to add a 3D object. All of these things up here are game objects. We can have empty objects, we can have 3D objects, 2D objects, light, audio, UI, which we'll talk about much later, particle systems, and even extra cameras if I wanted to. I'm going to add a 3D object, and in 3D object, they give me a few built-in objects that I can add. I'm going to add a cube. So my cube, right there, let's see if it shows up in my game preview. It does. Good. So my cube, let's look at it from this direction. So my cube is now in front of my camera, and notice that when I select the camera, it shows up in my camera preview. If I were to go into my game view to see this from the player's perspective, I can see that there is now a cube floating in the upper right-hand portion of my game view. Remember that when we deal with the Unity editor, the scene view is always based on our perspective, and the game view is always the perspective that the player will have. So this is what the player will see when we start the game. And any changes I make to this cube, let's say I wanted to move this cube to the left a little bit to center it better. Now I can see that that changes based on the perspective of the user. So I have a cube and I have all the other objects in my scene that make that cube visible. So let's take a look at what we have for some options in our cube. Each one of these things attached to the cube, so everything besides the transform, each of these is called a component. So the container represents the entire cube itself. Each of these individual menu items represents a component. With a camera, we had a camera component. With a cube, we have several different components. And with the light, we had our light component. We're going to end up getting very familiar with a lot of these, but basically what these components do is they allow us to change options specific to our object. For example, I can change how the object collides with other objects. I can change how the object casts shadows. I can change the color of the object. We're going to, next lesson, we're going to get into materials and shaders and talk about how we can make our objects a little bit more detailed and interesting. Basically, the way this class is going to be structured is the first couple of weeks, maybe a little longer, are going to be crash courses in 3D modeling. And then after that, we're going to worry about giving our objects behavior and how we write some custom code. But for now, we need to be able to actually build the objects that are in our game. So here's our cube. Here's our camera. The last thing that we need to talk about is the coordinate system. So the coordinate system in Unity, there are two different coordinate systems. The first one is called a global coordinate system. Those are the coordinates based on the coordinate plane maintained by Unity. So based on our entire scene. So in this scene that Unity has created, our cube is at negative 0.57, 1.26, 6.69. Okay? We also have what is called a local coordinate system. A local coordinate system means that if I have objects inside of other objects, they are going to have coordinates based on the inside of the object that they belong to. So we're going to take a look at a better example of that in class. But imagine, if we zoom in on our cube a little bit, imagine this cube is its own coordinate plane. And this is 0, 0. And we have -1 down here, +1 up here for our y, and then +1 for our x and -1 for our x, or in this case, our z value. This is what we mean by a local coordinate system. Every object in Unity maintains its own coordinate system inside of itself. But then it also maintains, as we can see in the transform window, it maintains its coordinates relative to the entire scene. So typically, what we're seeing in this transform window for all of these objects are the global coordinates. So let's talk about the 3 ways that I can modify this cube. When modifying a cube, we can do 3 different things. So game object transformations. The first game object transformation is called a translation. A translation is basically moving the position of the object. So it's what we were doing when I was dragging around the axes a moment ago. Now, the only thing that I don't really care for in Blender, so translation, or sorry, I keep saying Blender. The one thing I don't really care for in Unity is the shortcut system. So the shortcut for translations is W by default, or at least it should be. So if I press W, oh, maybe it's not going to work. I wonder if they have new defaults. Oh, maybe it's because I'm already in translate mode. Let's try switching out of translate mode to a different mode that affects it. Like this guy? Yep, there we go. Okay, so it's because I was already in translate mode. So translate mode shows these 3 arrows to allow us to manipulate the position of our game object. My other options, so that is done with W. My other options are rotation, which is done with E, and scale, which is done with R. So if I have this object selected and I press E, now instead of translation handles, I get rotation handles. So now I rotate around my object in this way. But let's take a look at what happens when we go back to translation. We go back to translation. Notice that my X, Y, and Z axes no longer reflect the global X, Y, and Z, right? Globally, X goes this way, Y goes up and down, and Z goes forward and back. But if I look at my object when I rotate it, its X goes diagonally, its Y, or Z goes diagonally, and its Y goes diagonally. This is what we mean by local coordinate systems. So game object transformations are local transformations. This means that any change that I make changes the relative axes of these objects. So it's operating under its own X, Y, and Z axes, and when I rotate it, it changes those axes. Scale works similarly. I can scale an object by either dragging it, the whole thing in the middle to make it big. I can drag just the Y direction, just the X direction, or just the Z direction to change the shape. And there it is. So we have these 3 different options: translate, rotate, and scale. in our toolbox. And again, if you've used Blender or taken 3D art and animation, this should all seem pretty familiar. The big difference in Unity is that we don't have quite as many options as we do in Blender, because Unity is not meant to be a 3D modeler or a 3D editor. Unity is meant to take those models and bring them all together and turn them into a game. So we're going to be doing some really simple 3D modeling in this class, but it won't be to the extent that we do in 3D art and animation. Okay, so now we have our transform tools. We understand that they only act locally. The last thing I want to show you guys is in our hierarchy editor. The hierarchy editor is called the hierarchy editor, or the hierarchy window, because not only does it show us what's in the scene, it also allows us to build hierarchies. In other words, it allows us to put objects inside of other objects. So I can go to Cube, right-click it, select 3D object, sphere, and now my sphere, notice, is spawned inside of my cube. So once my sphere is spawned that way, it takes the same dimensions, rough dimensions of my cube container. This is useful for creating complex nested scenes. It's also a really good way to group objects together. So if this sphere were in some way related to or connected to this cube in my scene, then I might want to attach them or nest them like this so that they are related. I can also drag stuff around in my Unity editor or hierarchy editor so that it changes the hierarchy, right? I just moved my sphere outside of my cube so it's no longer associated with the cube, or I can drag it back in. So in class, we're going to do some experimenting with the hierarchy editor. We're also going to do some experimenting with adding game objects and changing our perspectives. Thanks for watching.